I'll just give you a small introduction why we are doing what we are doing. So, in fact, it's now no secret that climate change is a reality, and there is enough science to with us to prove that. In fact, when we talk about climate change, immediately in India's context, we talk about the amount of coal that we are getting. So we have hundreds of mines that are operational, and we are anyways looking at increasing the target of producing around, looking at target of producing around billion tons of coal per year. It is a reality, and at the same time, it is also a reality that we are also bullish on renewables and have very, very ambitious targets. In India, we know that now coals and renewables are going to coexist together, at least for some time to come before we start phasing out the coal. But it is still away. We have a long path towards that. But over the last few years, especially say since the Paris Agreement, this concept of just transition has gained a lot of ground. Like for me, for in a very simple layman terms, the concept just means that it is ensured that when the transition away from coal takes place, no one is left behind, neither the communities nor the critical environmental issues. So it's just like taking everyone together while we're transitioning away. But can one solution fit all? Can the international model, which is being talked about across the world, Can that fit India? We're today starting this space to discuss exactly this, the Indian context. We hope this is the first one in many such discussions over the next 1 year. To take this discussion ahead or to help us in understanding this, we have a stellar cast of people with us. We have iFOREST, which is spearheading just transition work. We have Dr. Jayanta Mitra with us, who is working with TERI. We have Gareth Edwards, who is an international researcher working on the issue of just transition. We have Kavya Singhal, who is working with E3G, environmental think tank, on the issue of just transition. They're experts in their own areas, and over the last several years, they have been doing a lot of work related to just transition. We will start this space with asking the speakers to make their initial remarks, and then we will open the floor for a lot of discussions and questions. We intend that like this whole program will take about 60 to 75 minutes. Uh, so let's not delay this any further. Dr. Mitra, can I please, ask you to kickstart today's discussion and set the context for us that what exactly just transition means for a country like India?
Good evening, Mayank and everyone here. It's a great moment that all of us are together on this platform, and it's good to listen to each other and share our insights. And so, as Mayank, hello, am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are audible,
Yeah, yeah,
loud and clear.
yeah, yeah. So, whenever we talk of just transition and we, uh, think of moving away from coal, I mean, what comes to our mind is what would be the implications of moving away from coal? Who are going to be impacted? There are different segments of population, who are dependent directly or indirectly. There are businesses, who are dependent on coal. So entire coal value chain, how it's going to be impacted. So it's quite complex. It's not linear. So therefore, so whenever we talk of transition, I think it's crucial for us in Indian context, especially to map, who are the stakeholders, how is the coal value chain, how it functions today. Any incremental change is going to impact what kind of impact it will have, how those at the bottom of the pyramid, how they are going to be impacted. So all of that will take us to the discussion of, because whenever we go to coal belt, we find historically there is over dependence on coal because it helps us create revenue for the state. A lot of energy gets generated. In fact, 70% of country's primary energy coming from coal. All of us know that. Um, and on the other hand, one also finds islands of poverty. So this is a contradiction in a sense that you visit a coal belt where there are pockets of prosperity and also islands of poverty, and therefore it also sort of compels me to say that benefits are not percolating down. So that's one area of thought that I would like to park here for all of us to reflect on deeper. There's another area is, you know, the lot of informality is increasing all over. One finds that in coal sector, the informal labor participation is huge. It's about to the tune of about 15 million jobs in the informal sector. One finds, and so in the coal economy that creates about 0.4 million jobs in formal sector, but to that extent the informal sector workforce is huge, and more and more as one finds that coal is going to peak because of increasing demand. And one is, so on one hand you have net zero targets, you have that ambition. On the other hand, you also find increasing, coal targets, the production targets, etc. So there is a contradiction one finds now in such a situation. But at the same time, the cheapening of all these renewable energy solutions, the cost reduction in that also prompts you to think deeper, because that essentially would mean that coal mines are going to be closed in future. It may take 10 years, but unless we start deliberating on it from now, it's going to be late tomorrow, because it will certainly lead to social disruptions, and especially those who are at the bottom of the pyramid, the informal labor force, this workforce, essentially, they are going to be impacted hugely, and their vulnerability is going to increase unless we plan, ahead, proactively, because at this juncture, one finds they do not have the social, the kind of, we don't have the social infrastructure, we don't have the right skill, they don't have resources to fall back on, and they don't have the social protection, and therefore the vulnerability, that the vicious cycle, that continues. Then how do we convert this vicious cycle to a virtuous one is a great challenge before us. So that is one area, that informality I was talking about. So on the other hand, I was talking about renewable solutions that we have, the cost that is getting reduced, and which is also prompts us to think, that is going to, kind of, which would mean that more and more mines will be closed in future. On the other hand, you have increasing demand, and coal is going to peak in the next few years. Now, on the other hand, experiences from different countries tell us that, in the renewable sector, the engagement of labor may not be that high. So that's another issue. So all these coal mines that we have today, if moving forward they close down, if they're abundant, now do we have a situation which is kind of maybe not realistic in Indian context to assume that all these, despite the fact, with all best efforts, we impart new skills and we make them future ready, but all of them are unlikely to be absorbed, either in jobs, private jobs, or even energy jobs. How many green jobs could we create? So that's another area of concern. So that takes me to an area of, what kind of skills do we impart? Can we create an entrepreneurial ecosystem wherein we emphasize and tap into our local wisdom, the traditional knowledge and skills, the artisanal skills that forest-based produces, the agro-based produces, and create a market, collective-wise people. So I think that is an area we need to focus on. And the next point, I just would like to park here is, even within this vulnerable population, particularly the women, whether they would have equal opportunity of getting a decent job is something is very crucial. How do you restore their dignity and voice? Today, they're in a way voiceless. Uh, they're caught. They're entangled in the hands of the contractors who are powerful, and because of caste and class positions of many backward communities, and sections, today you find that they are often involved in a menial job. So that's another area. So how do we empower them? So what are the ways? How can we create a space where a dialogue can happen? Where they can express, they can become part of the solution. Since they are part of the problem, they need to be part of the solution as well.
This is indeed, yeah, Dr. Mitra, this is indeed very critical. In fact, this is one of the major areas for our discussion going forward.
Correct.
Uh, I will just like to now go to Kavya,
Sure. Sure.
so that we can take this discussion forward. Kavya, I
Right.
know that you have done a lot of work on the ground in terms of looking at what is happening with the community, especially from the labor perspective. Dr.
Right.
Mitra has outlined the kind of stakeholders that we have, why it is critical for us. Can you take this discussion forward and tell us about, from your experience, about these important stakeholders, the will on the ground, whether from the union side, whether from the perspective of politicians, whether from the perspective of authorities, how exactly what is happening on the ground, especially from the perspective of labor, who is one of the most critical stakeholders for the just transition in India?
Yes, thank you, Mayank, and thank you, Mr. Jain, for setting such a great context. First, I would just start by saying that if I have to define just transition in one phrase, it would be transitioning economy to net zero while leaving no one behind. And when I say leaving no one behind, communities constitute a major part of it. So, I mean, what does phasing down and just transition mean for a developing country like India, where millions of lives and livelihoods are directly or indirectly dependent on coal? As Mayank, you also mentioned that there is no one shoe fits all policy when it comes to transitioning away from coal, which makes the transition process extremely messy and complicated for India. So, I mean, I would like to share some of the experiences from the field and while I interacted with the communities. As Mr. Jayant also highlighted that India has a high incidence of informal economy, and most of the workers employed in the coal sector as well as coal allied sectors are either off roll or contract laborers. And the problem here is that these workers are excluded from company estimates, which makes them highly vulnerable to being left out of planned transition strategies. And without estimating the number of informal workers in each sector, it will be impossible to assess the quantum of risk associated with transitions. Also, one of the things to note is that there are no official data sets in India which capture the socioeconomic indicators of labor employed in coal and coal allied sectors. So it becomes imperative to understand the key characteristics of the workers employed in these sectors, be it coal mining or power, iron and steel, bricks, etc. They differ vastly in terms of their technological and organizational structure and workforce composition. So education level and skill set of a worker at a power plant is very different from a worker at an iron and steel unit. Even the skills of a coal miner, or for that matter, someone working at a coal thermal plant in the coal and ash handling facility is different from a solar plant operator. So we need to make sure that, as Mr. Jain mentioned, that almost 15 million people or 20 million people involved in the informal sector, we don't leave them behind in the process. And since the baseline differs between sectors and even within different job profiles in the same industry, it becomes crucial to create a socio-economic profile of these workers. This will help in assessing the extent and reskilling and retraining that will be required to transition the existing workforce to cleaner green jobs. One thing another which I noticed was within each sector, when we quantify the labor, it is important to consider that not all job profiles within a sector are at risk. Certain job profiles that can be retrained and reabsorbed in a new industry or even within the same industry, while some are transferable or some have low scope of reskilling and will end up being the most vulnerable to transitions. Uh, Now, I mean, coal is also one of the highest paying sectors and outperforms all other sectors, including power, iron, and steel and bricks in terms of wages. And there is a parity in wages between the on-roll and the off-roll employees in the coal mining sector due to the presence of strong labor unions as well as influence of local and political economy. So going forward, when the coal will phase down, these wages will be negatively impacted. Hence, it is imperative to find alternative livelihood options, which are not only sustainable in the long term, but also provide income which is more than or at least at par with what coal mining has to offer now. So, yeah.
Thank you, Kavya. Thank you for helping us understand what is happening on the ground and why it is important to address and understand things on the ground before the authorities, before everyone else in the ecosystem starts talking about just transition. Thank you so much. We also have now Gareth with us. Gareth is the associate professor at the University of East Anglia in UK, and he's the Leverhulme International Fellow, and right now working on a just transition project in Australia as well as looking at it in India. What I want to understand, Gareth, from you is if you can tell us or help us in understanding the international context of just transition, how things are happening in, say, in a country like Australia, and then just try and draw a parallel with India as well, because you have seen and understood or tried kind of analyze Indian context as well. If you can draw a parallel between the two.
Mayank asked me to draw some parallels between Australia and India, but actually, I'd say there's more contrast than parallels. So the just transition discussion is emerging in India, and it's emerging in Europe, and it's been in North America for a long time. But what's interesting in the Australian context is that there's not much talk of a just transition. Now, this might change. We've recently had a federal election. The new Labor government is much more keen to be portrayed as a climate leader. But in Australia, questions about transition are difficult because of the power of the fossil fuel sector and the way in which Australia's fossil fuel exports, particularly coal, but also gas, are seen as underpinning prosperity, but also often justified in terms of helping countries, for instance, like India, with development. So one of the things that I've always been keen to talk about and to think about is that actually just transitions are very context specific and context dependent. For instance, in Australia, the people working on ideas which might be considered to be focused on a just transition don't tend to use the terminology, and they look out to countries like Germany and Spain and Canada with the commissions and sort of institutional arrangements that they have developed. But these always need to be put into context. So in Australia's coal industry, for instance, the just transition discussion tends to be limited to workers in formal employment. And in Australia, very different from in India, those workers are very well paid, they have secure jobs, they've got the backing of labour movements behind them. And so that has caused issues within communities about whether a so-called just transition for them is actually just in the broader sense. Obviously, there's a very different question about what a just transition means in the Indian context, where, first of all, you have a lot more people speaking just of the coal sector, both formally and informally involved. And the nature of their employment is much more often subsistence-based. So, there's various factors at play. There's the sort of formal Coal India employees who can look forward to a pension and those sorts of things. But then there's a whole another set of layers of people underneath that whose dependence on coal is strong, but who won't necessarily be captured by any formal labour-focused just transition thinking. So that's one point of perhaps parallel in very different contexts. Because like in India, in Australia, there is whole economies and regional communities who find that they're dependent economically on coal production for their immediate economic productivity, but who don't necessarily get captured by any of the formal mechanisms towards a just transition. So I've been advocating in the Australian context for a broadening of the terminology. What do we mean when we talk about a just transition? Do we mean just looking after employees in fossil fuel industries such as coal, or do we mean a broader societal transition that doesn't leave people behind? And maybe the last thing that I'd say before I hand back, acknowledging that some of these things may have been covered by that there's a sort of interaction just transitions in different places that we always need to keep in mind. So the idea of a just transition from coal in Australia will have material impacts on the potential for and the nature of any just transition in the countries that Australia exports most of its coal to. At the moment, that's China, Japan, Korea, and in terms of metallurgical coal, India. And of course, there's proposals to export more Australian thermal coal to India as well. So my sense is that when we think about just transition, we need to do so in a nuanced way that pays attention to the relationships, not just between communities and workers in particular places, but between different places in the world. Mayank, please feel free to come back if anything is not making sense, or if the other speakers want to pick up.
Gareth, actually, I want you to, I want to start the discussion and go forward with you only. I want to ask that we have a lot of partnerships being talked about. We have partnerships that are already started on just transition. With so much different context in different areas, how is this interplay going to happen? Like, we have a partnership with South Africa, we have different India trying bilaterals and multilaterals and looking at loans and different partnerships on just transition. In that context, how do you see this interplay happening? How do you see the countries, or globally we coming on or developing one platform, or at least some or do you think that we will have to go by the national meanings or national contexts?
Well,
Mike, you were asking me?
Yes, Gareth. Gareth.
Oh, back to me?
Dr. Mitra,
Yep.
I'm asking Gareth back to him, and then I'm coming to you and Kavya.
Okay. I think, yeah, it's a wonderful point that you have raised. I think it's really crucial that, um, as I said, it's not a linear process, and it's very complex, and we need to learn from each other. So therefore, it's crucial that we exchange more and more, create a network and exchange, our rich experience and knowledge, and things that work, and how we could replicate those small successes across larger geographies. However, while learning from other models, it's crucial that we adapt it to our local context. So tweak it and align it with the local aspirations and needs. That's very important, I think, for us to understand and do that, and generate knowledge out of it, and disseminate that knowledge across. I think that's one way of coming together and learning from each other and experimenting with different models is something that should be. And apart from that, any transition on one hand would mean there will be a lot of reluctance. There will be an element of uncertainty and fear, and so on one hand we have to deal with it and create certain models, demonstrate certain projects, certain solutions on the ground, so that people are familiar with those processes and they participate. And otherwise there won't be any ownership of the process. Now it cannot be it cannot be imposed on the people, and therefore that participatory dialogue has to happen, which is non-intrusive, which is non-hierarchical. And so that sort of level playing field we could create as we come together more and more, and create a network, a knowledge platform. I personally feel that moving forward, we need to really strengthen that, because in Indian context, at least, just transition is not as yet a part of mainstream discourse, which has been already articulated by earlier speakers. So I think building that awareness, is crucial, and creating a narrative by different, and engage in a dialogue with media, with local institutions, with let us say panchayat, with community collectives, is really crucial. So that's important, and the narrative that they create can create a conducive atmosphere for this dialogue to happen more and more, and make people, communities future ready. So that is what I would imagine at this stage. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Mitra. Gareth, can I come to you for the same question? How do you see this interplay happening between different geographies, different countries? Because we all have, as you just pointed out, whether you compare India or Australia, we all have our different local contexts. So how do we see this partnership happening?
Yeah, I mean, some of it is purely regional in focus, and I think that there's there's good reason for taking a regional approach to just transitions. Perhaps in particular coal-producing regions or coal-consuming regions. But I guess the thing that I've been wrestling with is the way that those transitions become dependent on other places. So, you establish a particular relationship between two countries. There's lots of things to learn from the just transition experiments, I'd call them, in different places around the world, but they need to be grounded in local context. There's no kind of cookie cutter approach that you can just implement. The German Coal Commission is held out in Australia as the great promise of a just transition amongst the labour movement, but then when you talk to people in Germany, they say, actually, it was really messy and maybe it only worked in this context for these particular reasons. But I think what I said before and what I've been anxious to keep repeating is that these transitions don't happen in a vacuum. So the potential for India's transition to be just doesn't happen in a vacuum where you can ignore what's happening elsewhere. Australia, for instance, if a just transition agenda or policy in Australia leads to a slower phase out of coal, then that will mean that more coal is exported, because Australia exports 87% of its black coal, which will mean that transition discussions are complicated elsewhere. So there's a sort of connectivity across scales and across geographies that's important to keep in mind. It may not be the specific focus of a just transition narrative or agenda within particular geographies, but it's very important in terms of the overall outcome. I don't know if that helps.
No, that is very helpful, Gareth. I actually want to ask Kavya now. Kavya, you have seen how things are happening on the ground, and we, regularly talk about money. Do you think that the funds that we have on the ground, in terms of, say, DMF, in terms of cess, do you think that there is enough money, or we need to use these important tools like DMF, or say product like DMF or cess, to fund this transition?
Yeah. So if we actually look at the statistics right now, more than 80% of the green finance comes through domestic sources. And meanwhile, we are concentrating our discussion on the international climate finance debate. But I would like to draw attention to how we can actually use the domestic finance in funding just transition and such initiatives. So, I mean, if we look at the domestic finance, we can break it down into two parts. First can be the national level policies, which are already available. So policies in the form of skill development programs, be it Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana, and so many skill centers are now opening up, etc. But I think the penetration of those to the district level and the regional level is still limited. And if we can maybe ensure that those funds are to be used properly and more specifically, and more importantly, just under the just transition reskilling and upskilling category, that would be very useful. Second, as you mentioned, the district mineral foundation. Uh, so my experience from the field, and while interacting with various stakeholders, I came across that currently the utilization rate of DMF is really less. And in fact, I was analyzing the data for Jharkhand, and I did the analysis, and it showed that for the year 2021, the utilization rate was less than 50%. So if we can use it effectively, we already have an available pool of DMF, which can be used towards transitioning to green energy and community development. The government has actually mandated that 60% of the DMF contributions collected by each district should be applied in high priority areas, including healthcare, education, skill development, and sanitation. But right now, it is being largely spent on mega infrastructure projects. So, I mean, these are some ways by which we can actually utilize domestic funding in a better way. And while obviously there's a need for mobilizing international finance, but while we wait for the required volume to come in, these are some ways we can use the domestic finance.
Thank you, Kavya. In fact, when we talk about the international partnerships, when we talk about the international Indian context, we generally talk about climate and how different. We talk about how the developed world needs to give money to the developing countries and the whole the climate finance debate we have. Gareth, do you think in this the kind of system that we have, wherein we are not even sure of the international finance for climate, do you see there is a space for international collaboration, international funds for GT in a country like India?
I think it would come through different kinds of networks. So, the international labor movement might be interested, or other sorts of mechanisms. I find it unlikely to come through sort of formal governmental grants or multilateral funding streams. But I think the question of transition is on everyone's mind at the moment. And it's about, it's this kind of interaction for me between the questions about just transition and climate justice, right? Because the argument that's been made by India and also by most of the developing countries is that actually, the developed or Annex 1 countries, you
He lost his voice, man.
Yeah, I'm just messaging him.
developed countries. Sorry, am I back?
Yes, you are back. We lost the connection, I
Yeah,
think.
sorry about that. I think I was just saying that the prior step is will there be actually finance for climate finance from the developed world at all, which is the point that you raised. So I think before there is that, there won't be any formal finance for a just transition. But there may be other networks. So the example I was giving maybe before I got cut off was international labor networks or those sorts of things, where there could be sort of interest in collaborating. Apologies about my connection.
No worries, Gareth. Thank you so much. I just want to tell people listening to us that Gareth will be leaving in 5 minutes. If there is any question specifically for Gareth, we can ask him now, or otherwise, we can take the discussion forward with other discussion points. Is there anything specific any of us wants to ask Gareth from the audience? If yes, please request for the mic and we will.
Mayank, I can keep an eye on that.
Perfect.
And you
Perfect.
maybe, yes, go on.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just to say, if anyone wants to reach out to me afterwards, please, you know where to find me. So, yeah, please do reach out. I'm really sorry I had to join late and leave early.
No, that's kind of you, Gareth. Thank you so much. In fact, I want to now understand from Kavya. Kavya, when you go on the ground, whenever you have done your work, especially in terms of communities, do you see people being aware? As Gareth said, that in Australia, a lot of workers or a lot of stakeholders involved are not aware about just transition. Do you see that in Indian context as well? Do you see the laborers, the unions, the other stakeholders on the ground, say local leaders, local administration? Is there any conversation on just transition there at this moment?
So, if we look at the conversation on just transition, I think it is still very limited to the think tank and government level. And when we interact with the communities, they are not actually aware of what's happening. I mean, they have witnessed mine closures over the years, and it has impacted them adversely. But this is going to, like, they will have to face this in the coming years. They are not aware of it. Also, because the closures have been unplanned till now. But to make them aware of the fact that, okay, coal is going to go away, may not be immediately, but in the next 10 years or 20 years, that is a major challenge. And which is why involving the communities in that dialogue becomes very important. Right now, the communities are not involved in that dialogue yet. And I mean, I got a chance to interact with a few union leaders as well, and they can play a major role in unifying people and making them aware that what can be the alternate options for them, or what kind of future they look for themselves. I mean, that kind of a conversation is very important, but it is not happening right now. And if we want to make just transition strategies, involving the communities in that is imperative. Also, I would like to add that conveying this to them that okay, coal is going to go away and they'll have to like look for some alternate livelihood options, and we'll have to create alternate livelihood options for them without creating that ripple effect amongst them, without creating that fear of losing jobs. That also is a major challenge while initiating that dialogue.
Thank you, Kavya. Dr. Mitra, we have understood how things are happening on the ground. We have seen a lot of conversation happening in the administration circle among the authorities on just transition. While, as like with think tanks, how they are working with different organizations and different government departments. Do you see a conversation, a multi-stakeholder conversation happening on the central or on the national or the state level as far as just transition is concerned? Do you see that participation being invited or being encouraged?
Uh, yeah, I mean, okay, I will answer to your question, but I would also like to get back and share some of my field insights after that. Is indeed, as at the state level and national level, when I interact, when our team goes and interacts at different levels, we observe that there is a general tendency to postpone this discussion or deliberation on this theme. And however, recently, the coal ministry, they have engaged kind of, with a multilateral organization. And the World Bank has started some initiative, of understanding the situation on the ground in certain states like Orissa, in Jharkhand. And they are rethinking actually, how, what kind of, I mean, if they have to understand it through just transition lens, what sort of planning process needs to, unfold. So that is there. However, uh, when the discussion regarding energy transition started, we were kind of response that we received was, let's not talk about energy transition now, and it's not the right time. We can talk about just transition. And but somehow we fail to understand, how do you de-link, because according to me both these are so interlinked, they're inseparable, they're intertwined. So but somehow that understanding is not there, and somehow there are many at that level, that in the administration, in the industry, at the government level, they feel, we are still grappling with, a lot of technological issues, and we don't have answers. We don't have sufficient land if we are talking of solar based solutions. And so there are also imagination that how we diversify, to more kind of energy industry, from extractive industry to energy based industries. Now, so there are a lot of, technological glitches, and I'm sure that would require huge finance, from within and outside. So and therefore the belief from within, what we here is, this is something that's going to impact us 20 years, 30 years down the line. So this is not an immediate issue that we need to reflect on. So it's a kind of, it's good to have a debate and deliberation. There are different thought processes. We need to capture that. At the same time, like Kavya, as she was saying, she's interacting at different levels. We are doing, and like us, there are many who are like iFOREST is also already started taking a deeper dive. So all of us need to echo this and connect people, who are interested to dialogue on this, discuss on this, and think about future. How do we prepare ourselves to respond to that kind of situation? So I think it's important to dialogue, to discuss, to deliberate, to debate. And I'm sure 100% overnight, things will not change. There's no magic wand to revolutionize things overnight. It is a gradual process, but unless we start debating and discussing from now, it's going to be late if we do it after 10 years, 20 years. So that's the message. And while doing so, a kind of, if we can drive home the message of empathy, how we make our next generation future ready, what are the possibilities, what kind of skills are needed. So what kind of, how do we ensure there is no exclusion of different segments? So, we need to really ponder over that together. And I believe I just wanted to share what Kavya was mentioning about DMF fund. And you find over the years, thousands of crores that have been accumulated over the years. And if you look at allocation and utilization, it is so disproportionate considering the magnitude of the problem on the ground. So on the other hand, there are excellent state level policies, the schemes that are designed for people, like you have state rural livelihood mission. So all need to converge. Now, what one finds, and I'm sure Kavya and others will agree here, that when we go to field, we find there is a disconnect. There's a huge knowledge, information deficit, digital divide, and it is important for us to really bridge that gap. uh, Schemes that are designed meant for people, it's not really flowing down. So there has to be a kind of local capacity created, some conduit or mechanism which can really connect both, so that people are leverage the benefits of these schemes, so which is not happening now. So, and whether coal continues, peaks, or coal phases out, eventually, general socioeconomic condition and vulnerability, if you look at, the situation on the ground, that drives one to the fundamental question of social and human development issues and complexities, I think. So we need to really converge and see what kind of schemes that are existing today, how we leverage that, and the DMF fund, rather than just investing on infrastructure, which is important, but how do we build those soft skills? What kind of leadership capacity we can create? The local capacity do we create? How you can create an alternative market, because people don't bother whether their earning comes from coal or non-coal. It's just that the situation on the ground is there is no choice. I have come across many families who regularly, the youth from those villages, they migrate, they go to Goa even, for fishery, and they earn certain amount of money. And what is interesting, I just want to share some of my insights from the field. Am I is it okay if
Yes,
I
please.
continue?
No,
Yeah.
no problem.
So yeah, especially if you look at generally coal and other industries dependent on coal employ contract laborers, which we have already said, from the surrounding areas, and this has created opportunities for higher wages as opposed to what people use from agricultural labor jobs, leading to a major switch of the youth away from agricultural operations. As working in the fields means more hard work and greater risks. So what one finds that, hello, hello.
Yes,
Yeah.
Dr. Mitra.
So what one
Yes,
finds
Dr.
today
Mitra,
is
you're right.
consequently the burden of agricultural work shifted completely towards the women, who are compelled to manage home and fields both. So this is a kind of, the burden has been shifted to women, and that is they are loaded with all these roles and responsibilities. And there is incrementally higher wages that they receive, from different industrial opportunities that allures youth. But along with that, what also one finds, which is disturbing, that there are many in the village and outsiders who came in, from other districts, also from within the state or from outside the state. They find it a great opportunity to make money out of illicit distillation, and which consequently resulted into a lot of deaths among the youth and many lives lost. Several villages that we go around, we find this is a common. It has alcoholism has become a menace, and people who received a lot of compensation, crores of rupees, after having lost their land or as a compensation, but they don't know how to invest that money because they lack financial literacy. I think, and they tend to spend away their entire compensation amounts on cars or bikes or something, they a movable property, and after some time they really fail to maintain, and everything is lost. So I think the financial literacy is also important, and industry cannot washes his hands off just by giving certain amount of money, X amount of money. And there are ample examples we have come across, and how they have gone back to the same situation they started in, and today they don't have land, and therefore they were nowhere. But the situation is worse, for those people lose their ownership over the land, which renders them really vulnerable as they lose their source of livelihood and self-sustenance. But land ousties, on one hand, you find are absorbed in regular jobs and they get compensation, but there is no job replacement for those who are landless. So that is another area of concern, who are dependent on agricultural land of others. And earlier there was a kind of understanding of getting a crop share if you were working on somebody's land, a landless laborer. Now, so that is also snatched away. Your dependence on forest is snatched away because you have lost that land, that dependence on forest, and suddenly, you are trying to, a kind of unfamiliar practices imposed on them, and they are not used to it, of earning certain amount of money and going to the market and procuring food, etc., for themselves, and that dependence on their forest, on each other, that social capital, everything getting weakened, which is also another area of concern. So many also grapple with the land documents, the patta, for the homestead land or agricultural land.
Dr.
Yeah.
Mitra, thank you so much for just outlining these concerns and all the areas that we require cooperation on. But I just want to understand from a very simple perspective, when we talk about just transition in Indian context, do you see, do we see the Indian industry, how do we see Indian industry in Indian industry's role? Do we see that they are an active participant in terms of finance, in terms of money to be put, in terms of their participation in the policy? How do we see that happening? Do we see a participation of Indian industry? Kavya, do you want to take that up? Or Chinmay? Please, please. I know I am putting you on the spot, Chinmay, but if you can.
Hi, everyone. Mayank, when you talk about industry, I would like you to be a little more specific on the kind of industry that we're referring to. I mean, first is obviously, your producer, like the coal producing industry or the PSUs you have. Second is the industries who depend on coal, for instance, and then there could be other industries which could, be supportive of the transition. So one distinction that I could put forth is that. PSUs are aware, but they also, their role they feel will be largely, their obligation will be to their workers and their employees who are departmental, and that might not be a very big obligation going ahead. In terms of the other industries, I feel their take is largely on looking at diversification, and I think they're already being extremely, like, they are seeking after their business, and in that scenario they are being extremely foresighted in terms of how they will change their fuel mix and what kind of impacts it may have on their workers. So, and they feel that they will require a lot of reskilling and retraining of the workers, but it may not impact in terms of unemployment. And then you can have about financing transition. Financing is a broader subject on which industry and who and what kind of philanthropies can come into finance this transition. So that's a very broader subject, and I think that opinion is not really very visible right now because a lot of people are not seeing it happening on the ground as of now. The conversation is very new still. So I hope that answers your question to some extent.
It definitely to some extent. But okay, let me ask you a point blank question about people who are directly mining coal, the coal producing ones. If I talk about that particular industry, that particular
Okay.
section.
Okay, so in terms of financing, or like in terms of creating any kind of frameworks for compensation or any kind of support, I think being PSUs right now, most of them are looking at expansion. So that's their vision, but they do not deny that things might change, policies and the market might drive the direction eventually after a few years, 5, 7 years, very differently from what it stands now. So in that scenario, they acknowledge it, but in terms of their obligation, it's very clear. Their obligation is largely to the workers who are employed with them, who are the departmental employees. And that obligation, most of them feel is going to be little. It's largely be in terms of pension, because they are not, the hiring of workers is not, it's kind of stopped or it's slowed up right now. And they are looking at a much more aging workforce going ahead. So in the next couple of decades, we see many more employees retiring, and their obligations will be in terms of pension support providing. The larger question they all point out is contract workers, informal workers, which technically speaking they're not obliged to, as per contracts, to take care of beyond their employment. So that's their role. In terms of diversification, they are governed by CIL, so that largely becomes a question of the government and how much they want to diversify and into what. And depending on the kind of industry, it will need they will need workers to be reskilled. But and they will be more than happy to absorb what the people, because that's typically has been the trend so far with PSU. So they try to absorb the workers as much as they can. So that's largely their take. But in terms of actually planning, thinking of it, they are not actively, because they know their obligation is to departmental employees, which is anyway there, and they'll anyway have to pay the pensions, they'll anyway have to pay the security that they have to do, or they might have to look at VRS schemes, but that will be little because a lot of their employees would be retiring. And not many, and they're going into contract mode, more MDO mode, so they might not need that support, need to provide that support.
Thank
I
you
can
so much.
add to this,
Yeah,
Mayank.
yeah, please, please,
Yeah,
please, please.
so I think the number of employees in Coal India are already at its lowest right now. And as Chinmay also mentioned, that most of them are in the retiring age. And the youth which is coming now, and this is one of my experiences from the field as well, that most of them have certain level of skill set and certain level of technical degrees with them, and they don't want to be employed in the coal mining sector anymore. So they are looking for other options. But due to lack of economic diversification, there are not many alternatives available to them. So, I mean, the number of jobs are already at its lowest in the coal mining sector. And if we talk about the expansion, I think going forward, because of the lack of coal demand, even the existing coal mines will be financially unstable, like unsustainable and economically unviable, let alone the new ones. So, the expansion in that way will also be very restricted.
That's a helpful point, Kavya. Thank you so much. Uh, we are about to finish our session. In fact,
Uh,
Dr. Mitra, any last thoughts on
Yeah, I
before we
just
close the
want
session?
to, yeah, I think this is a very valid discussion. I really appreciate these points about how industry is preparing and their response. Just wanted to draw your attention to if you look at downstream, the MSME sector, the who are dependent on coal in different ways. I mean, the entire scenario is very different. You look at brick sector, you look at foundries, you know. Very obsolete technologies being used there, and that they're kind of they are very highly polluting industries, and very labor intensive and obsolete technologies, as I said. And they're they have only profit orientation mostly, but this new generation is gradually being open to newer ideas and newer thoughts, but they have a long way to go. So I think in SMEs, MSMEs, when you look at downstream dependent on coal, so I think we need to have a clear blueprint that how do we switch towards a more sustainable lifestyle, options and greener solutions. And it really requires a lot of fund. It requires a lot of coming together, and some interaction a few months ago we had in Howrah with the foundry sector owners, and we sensed that where in that platform, even the lot of DIC, even government officials came in, and the skill council people were also there, and we sensed that the foundry associations and so on, that there was huge information deficit. So everyone is sitting in there in silos and working from there and designing, and having their own flagships. But somehow the information is not flowing. There is no exchange. And I think that was a bigger challenge before us. So I think we need to come together. We need to bridge these gaps and design a solution together. So that's something that I want to say here.
Thank you, Dr. Mitra. Thank you so much. In fact, I'll be very honest. Uh, this was one of the first space that we are looking at organizing in this on this topic, and the conversation has actually given me a lot of points to ponder upon and think about the future ideas. Uh, we will keep it very brief. I think our time is also over. I have been told by my host that our time is over now. But I thank you for everyone who spoke and everyone who listened to the program for the last hour. I'll request that if you think that we have missed out on anything, or if you think that we need to focus on something in particular, please feel free to reach out to us. And we want to take this conversation ahead. And the major takeaway for me from this whole session is we need to work together if we want to have a very healthy discussion and very fruitful discussion over just transition. Thank you so much, people, for joining us today. I think we'll end the session for now. And until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayank, for taking this initiative. Yeah.
Thank you so
Uh,
much, Dr. Mitra.
the
And we should keep
recording
this
for this.
dialogue alive, I think. Yeah, we should keep this dialogue alive. Yeah.
Manju,
Thank
you
you,
were saying
everyone.
something?
Yes, no, thanks everyone for lending their time to us. The session has been recorded, so please feel free to go back and share and maybe go through the session again if possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank you
everyone.
very much.
Have a
Thanks.
great weekend.
Wish you the same. Thank you.